Good evening and welcome tonight to Washington County Kids Parent Speaker Series, How to Help Your Child Who is Experiencing Bullying. My name is Larry Corpo. I'm the Executive Director of Washington County Kids, and I'm very pleased that you've all joined us tonight. Our mission is to promote and increase access to quality out-of-school and summer programs for all youth in Washington County. We believe after-school and summer programs help youth achieve their full potential in many ways. And one of the things that we do is tonight's speaker series, which is geared to help parents through types of events with information on topics that we hope that you will all find relevant. Also joining us tonight from Washington County Kids is Katie Riley, President, and Jessica Sim, Program Coordinator, who these two have put all the pieces together tonight and will also be helping us facilitate questions. So please use the Q&A or the chat at any point during the program. We will do a Q&A session at the end as well. So now I get the honor of introducing tonight's speaker, Jonathan Colon, who is the Deputy Director at Central Cultural and who has a distinguished educational background from civil engineering to nonprofit leadership and everything in between. I was reading your bio, quite fascinating. He has also provided a variety of services, bilingual and bicultural manner, and has demonstrated a lot of success in reaching out to Oregon's expanding but underserved Latino and minority communities. So, Jonathan, I want to thank you for sharing your time and talents with us tonight, and we are ready to turn it over to you.
Today, we're going to talk about what to do if your child's being bullied. And I think one of the important things about this conversation is to think about more often what we're defining, right? So what is it that we are defining in the environment that we are in? How do other people define it? So one of the interesting things is that not all of us have the same definition. So when we're trying to solve or problem solve for the issue, we're not having the same language. So it's really, really important that in the circles that you're trying to mitigate the bullying, you want to know what the common definition is. There's some things that at my house are not tolerated and we would consider it bullying. There's some things culturally that I would consider it that way. But there's a system has decided, schools have defined it, parks have defined it. So different environments have a definition. So this is some of the common ones, but I also think that there's an opportunity to have an extended dialogue with the environment that the action's happening. So a lot of times bullying is tied to the use of aggression with intention of hurting another person, right? So what happens to anything that's not with that intention, right? And that's a place where sometimes conflict happens, and dialogue and communication is super important. So when people think of bullying, a lot of times they think about physical violence, they think about attacks, they think about verbal taunt, name calling, put downs, intimidation, threats, the physical stealing of money and possessions, and the exclusion from a particular group. So this is what this is a working sort of definition that people use. I always, wherever space I'm in and we're having a conversation, I like to know what is the definition that we're working in, right? Sometimes it may be, related to a cultural difference, an environmental or understanding, or what the capacity is of the individuals in the room to do that, right? There's always this debate about something that we call childhood conflict. These are things that people have, and these are interpersonal sort of conflicts. So we always think about the difference between what bullying is and what childhood conflicts are. Both should be addressed. The important part about it is to note that you do have to address both, They just may not have the same sort of strategy for resolutions, right? So again, bullying is intentional. We talked a little bit about that it is a clear pathway to provide unwanted, unwelcome behavior, right? There's another trait to it that the behavior is often repetitive, right? So it people say that if it has to happen more than once, it doesn't really have to happen more than once. And I think that it's always good to, again, know what the tolerance is for action. Sometimes people say, well, it was only one time, but the impact to the individual who has to feel it can go on a lot more than just because it was a one-time incident, right? And there's traditionally there's always an imbalance of power. There's the notion of powerlessness and intimidation when it happens. And it's important to have these working knowledges because you want to walk into your space as an advocate for your child or as training or having the dialogue with your young person or your child around what this is. So having an understanding of what we're defining is always helpful. There's others like the act of committing by one or more people against another. So it can be done by one person or a group. There's also the concept of, it could be happening with one individual in the midst of a lot of other people. And sometimes people think that there's just only one person, but there's lots of other people who watch and did nothing, right? Or did not intervene. So that becomes sort of a group sort of activity. Always there's always a tend to be able to identify that there's a real or perceived imbalance of power. And it is the intimidation is it could be the physical strength or it could be the social status of the individual who is causing sort of the bullying. One thing that we talk about myths and facts, and we'll walk through a couple of these because I think it's helpful to be reminded or refresh some of the social norms, the social conversations that we walk into when we're trying to de-escalate or trying to intervene or advocate on behalf of a young person who is being a victim of such. So one that's common, and I've heard it quite often, is that girls don't bully. And that's far-fetched, right? Girls often use verbal and social bullying, and bullying for girls escalate during middle school. So sort of the science and sort of the people who are tracking this see that there's an increase in middle school. You want to question what is happening in middle school. And it's one of those eras in time when you're defining who you are. You're defining this transition from elementary to middle school. And that also happens a couple of other times. So one of the things that contributes or is a scenario to feed this is these life changes, these transitions sort of in that educational pathway for individuals. It also could be when you move into a new neighborhood or when you have a change that takes away some of the knowns that people have. There's always a concept that words will never hurt you. I think we have riddles and we repeat these because they're automatic to a lot of us who grew up with these things. And, yes, there's no physical bruises or broken bones, but these words could really have these deep emotional scars, especially in times when someone is very vulnerable and going to transition. So, there's always a debate about where physicality, right? So physicality of bullying is harder than words, and there is a sector that really believes that sometimes the emotional, the verbal, is the one that stays with people the longest. A scar is a story of something that happens when you physically can see a scar. The emotional scar is a really hard one unless we've done some work around sort of working through that. So it's a very significant sort of impact to a young person. Um, we sometimes digress and sometimes sort of diminish the teasing, right? So it's only teasing, right? And in teasing in which a child is not heard is not considered bullying. There's a concept that teasing becomes bullying when the intent of the actions is to hurt or harm one. I still debate that because I think words have an impact, and we just talked about that a minute ago. So when you're in these spaces and you're mitigating sort of and advocating for that young person, you want to know what that working definition is, because I think sometimes things are dismissed because they're just playing, they were teasing. It's a childhood sort of interactions as part of growth. And I think it's in these situations, it is an indication that a heart to heart, a conversation, a check-in needs to happen. Bullying will make my kid tougher. I will tell you that my father, my grandfather, and my uncles believe that. And this is a really interesting one for me because I always think about, we talk about bullying as it relates to young people and children, but we don't actually talk about bullying as it shows up in society, among your relatives, around your friends. And the piece that's really interesting about that is that our young people learn from what they see versus what we say. And in a lot of cases, we've normalized this. I have an aunt and she has a story, and she's reminded that whenever she comes to the house, not my house, but my family, that the family, whatever family house is, that she should leave her car somewhere, a little bit far away because people are embarrassed about that and joke about that. And if it was a child, we would really consider those words, and because we're adults, it seems to feel that it's okay. So I think the idea that it makes you tougher, it's not necessarily, well, it's not true. One, it actually can really have a deeper impact, as those emotional sort of scars we talked earlier about. And lowering a child's sense of self-esteem and self-worth. Bullying creates that increased anxiety in children. And, it's the same that adults do when you go into a particular group and you feel, am I going to be criticized? Am I going to have to sit apart from everybody? Am I going to be isolated? And we forget that our young people are seeing that same behavior. So sometimes, is us as adults really checking ourselves in terms of, how does my behavior as an adult reinforces some of the behaviors that is very impactful in a developing mind as a young person? Because if they see it, it doesn't really matter what we say, right? So the next one about the myth and the facts. So bullying is a normal part of childhood. And regardless of how people feel, it doesn't need to be so. And it is one of these things that, because someone thinks that it's true, it doesn't excuse the impact that it has. It could be a common experience, but this type of aggression towards others should not be tolerated. Children and youth are bullied will always tell an adult, and we all know that is absolutely not true. I think people questioned what it would mean to indicate that. So it's this piece about building a relationship with a young person, about having conversations and not having conversations when things happened. I think a lot of times we tend to speak to a particular issue when it happens, and sometimes doing exercises and scenarios and what ifs. I am still one of those individuals that before I go into something, I play it in my head, and it usually is a lot better when it actually happened. I was driving in yesterday, and I was going through my PowerPoint, and I'm feeling, although all the things that is happening right now, I'm still feeling really good about the PowerPoint, right? So because I've rehearsed it enough times that I'm comfortable with it, even though I'm dealing with sort of these things, right? So most studies find that, up to 25% of bullied children reports to adults. Sometimes they fear that retaliation or that the adult won't take their concerns seriously. Children and youth who are bullied are mostly loners with few social skills. The fact is that many bullies are often the cool or the popular student. These students have friends who provide the support for their actions. And this is an area that, we recognize the spectrum of how we show up in the world. There are quiet people, and there are analytical people, and there's, very loud and sort of excitable people. And you're a young person in your life, and how they're showing up in the world. So it's important to have those dialogues about who they are and how they show up in the world in comparison to some of the individuals that will show up in their lives that are like this and what the potential is. Bullied kids need to learn how to deal with bullying in their own on their own. And yes, some kids have the confidence and the skills to stop a bullying when it happens, but many do not. I think one of the attributes that kids who have the confidence and the skills is that someone has worked on their confidence and the skills to manage situations like this. And sometimes for many different, we don't have that opportunity to build these components, right? Adults have a critical role to play in helping to stop bullying, and as do other children who witness and observe bullying. Sometimes you don't necessarily want to sort of have another kid intervene, but you want to have them know that they can always report what they're experiencing. And sometimes that could really save a kid and can really impact. A lot of times, one person who's witnessing a bullying, you may be the next target. So having that dialogue and having that ability to have that dialogue with that young person is super crucial in being able to find these facts. One of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit about is one of the things is that, we talk about verbal, we talk about physical, and we talk about relational bullying, and these are comments, right? So this is what traditionally people think of when you think of bullying. In 2023, in 2020, in 2021, and in the 2000s, we have a new way, right? And it's this cyber sort of bullying, right? And it becomes a really hard one because there are avatars who are doing it. There are people who you may not know. And in today's society, we depend on these tools of communication. We depend on these vehicles, whether it is our cell phones, whether it is our pad, whether it is our Chrome, which is our computer, to do many tasks. So we're constantly on these things. It is a tool from education. So it's one of these things that cyberbullying shows up, and it shows up in the comfort of your home, which is the most sacred space. So you're sitting in your room and you're being attacked inside your house, in your room. And I think that changes sort of the perspective where you cannot get away from those who are, assaulting you in that way. And there's feelings of isolation, there's feelings of depression, there's frustration and anger, there's feeling of humiliation, and you tend to show signs of illness because of that stress, and that anxiety that this isolated things. I could be here doing this and something might be popping up in my phone or my computer. So the question is, how do we interact with these things, and what conversations we have with those young people in our life to sort of mitigate some of these things, right? Cyberbullying is the repetition, intentional, and power imbalance. And in this way, in this particular scenario, the imbalance is not physical, it's not social, it's the ability for someone to assault you or be aggressive towards you behind a screen, behind an avatar, or an unknown, from the shadows and the darkness, right? Six high school student reported bullying electronically in the early 2020s when we were still in the school building. 33 of middle school children sort of experienced some level, 31% of high school, so that's 5% of primary schools. So these are people in elementary. And then 30% of female high school students experienced bullying at school or electronically in the last year, compared to about 90% of the males. And it's the top for teens, that they experience, right? I think some of the ones that are lasting and emotional is, sort of that false rumors that get spread, that receiving images. That's the other. You don't actually have to use words. You can send images. There's physical threats and things of this nature, right? So it's one of these that continues, and we will continue to see a rise in this one. 50% of our students report that they didn't know who bullied them. So it's still that darkness, that fearful thing, and that's sometimes tied back to our experience as children, right? We grew up. Some of us grew up being scared of the darkness, right? Or our parents, scared us into compliance or behavior by saying that something was going to catch us for being bad kids, right? So it's these early on experiences sort of show up in this thing when you have an unknown force that is coming after you. So you can't see me, and I can't see you. It can happen all day long. And the one that I think is sort of that punitive fear of reporting it comes from being able to lose the privilege of having whatever tool is that you computer, cell phones, because what we would do is we would remove it to protect them. But it is because of that fear, people tend not to. So this is something that I think we need to really spend some time, right? Sort of thinking about how to protect our systems, how to protect our cyber sort of environment from this type of action, right? So who bullies target, and people talk about often about where people are, what people perceive vulnerable individuals, and it's just a perception of who they think are vulnerable. Individuals who are isolated, who have few friends or no friends, young people who are not assertive, and sometimes it's that definition of assertion. Some people may be assertive, but they're not, sort of physically assertive. And then people who they can identify of having low self-esteem and lack of self-confidence. One of the things is that we, as the adults, or sort of the advocates or the caretaker or the facilitator in these young people's lives, is we have to be vigilant and sort of look for normal patterns, and then look at it and know our young people enough to know when that pattern sort of shifts. So, things to look out for, right? Sort of that fear of going to school, or avoiding wanting to go, suddenly a change in grades. And there are many, many, many things that could be happening, but it's those little trigger, right? Health conditions, right? Stomach aches, headaches, rashes, you know, uh, I can't think of anything at this point, but also, sort of nail biting, things of that nature. Withdrawing or losing interest in activities. And, there's lots of reasons to have that dialogue with that young person, because they're also going to transition. So some of these things could be considered natural when people are moving through their different transitions, or as part of development. But being able to talk about those and ensure that they're not related to this, to that they're being impacted by bullying. Feeling sad and anxious and depressed and withdrawn, or sort of, hopelessness, or hopeless. And, sort of unexplained injuries. And even with explain injuries, thinking about whether they're logical explanations of injuries. So some signs that one would look like missing things, right? Whether clothes, items, losing valuable things, money, jewelry, iPhone, bags, sneakers, belts, out of nowhere. Sleeping, right? Nightmares, changes in eating habits, spending or avoiding excess time on the computer. Again, how they're reacting after they get off their cell phone, or they're reacting after they get off their Zoom. I mean, not their Zoom, their computers. Really thinking about, are they leaving it as a positive thing, or are they leaving with some sense of depression or anxiety, becoming aggressive and disruptive, and maybe be bullied of other kids or siblings, right? So if they start sort of enacting sort of the things that are happening to them with others around them themselves, it's always a good question to sort of have when you start seeing those shifts. What can parents do to help? And I think this is not a solution, it's not an answer, but it's some things that we will point out in terms of being able to have dialogue and seeing if these make sense for you and where your young person is, right? This is a hard one, because I even have a hard time just creating this environment with people who I work with or people who I interact in as an adult. But talking with your child, sort of cultivating and maintaining open, candid communications. I always tell people, maybe doing scenarios and saying, hey, just thinking, what would you do if this happens, right? Or what do you think about these things at a random conversation? Sort of you start thinking what they're thinking about and how they would sort of react to the scenarios. So when they do begin to sort of surface, they have a better grasp of what they want to do based on what they've already discussed, and also provides that idea that anything's up for conversations, right? Any topics up for conversation by having these scenario-based conversations at random sort of times, right? These are some ideas around how to start a conversation. I think most people know their person, their young person, and you know where they are in their development and their transition. So sometimes it's finding that way too, right? So sort of a diverted sort of coming into the conversations, right? There's been a lot of news about people being bullied lately. Do you know people dealing with this, right? So have you ever had any problems with people on the internet? Or do you know someone, or Have anyone ever bothered you or threatened you? And these are sort of things that are may come to you as in some cases as being common. It actually may be things that this is not how that young person would receive or interact. But the idea behind this is to come up with these questions that are, sort of open-ended, but also giving scenarios so that they can see themselves identify, right? Do you know kids who are picked on in school? And it's not directed to that young person. It's sort of neutralizing it to say what you've seen, what you've experienced. How can I help you make it stop without embarrassing you if something comes up for them? I think our job is as protectors and providers a lot of times. So sometimes asking for a direction and approach sounds contra the norm, but it's sometimes you may treat it in a way where it's not how you would handle it, but it gives that young person the ability to keep face or not feel embarrassed or build a confidence that they have someone that is on their side. There's a cyberbullying.us it's a good place to sort of poke around and look at some of their materials and look at some of their videos and a lot more in terms of sort of the situational sort of conversations. And then this is one that I always talk about for parents is like your child may not always talk, so observe and listen. I think that if there's something that we can do is being attentive. That's the only way you're going to know that something has changed. And, that's harder to do in this fast world that we live in, right? And all the stuff that we have to accomplish and, but it's one that's so important because if you're not observing and listening, you may miss subtle clues or just even the opportunity to start those conversations that may lead you to these answers of what's occurring. So what can parents do? You can emphasize to your child, help them understand bullying is wrong. And it's not their fault. And I always say that if you can do this at a time when it's not happening, it's much better received, right? And it's sometimes the approach is like, if you ever see someone being bullied, I mean, I think it'll be helpful for them to know this because I think it's really important for them to know that it's not their fault or, sometimes is misdirected. Sort of the medicine to the situation by not necessarily making it theirs, but also but making it as something that they can provide to others, and in that process, the absorption may be a lot more. When it happens, please document it over and over again. I think one of the things is that I think for a lot of us, when we're in it, we're so emotionally charged that we don't write it down, so we forget the details, and the details sort of begin to sort of unravel. So documenting these things are helpful. It helps you when you're addressing them and who you need to address them with. If you see, inappropriate emails, Facebook posts, online communications, know where to print screens, right? Where's that button on? And I should not be telling you about how to use technology because I just had a lot of blunders right now, but there is a screen that says print screens, right? You can print those out. You can print copies. You can snap pictures of what you have and save those. Those are super important. Again, I said, kids see and learn from what they see and the actions than what they hear you say. So, sort of that piece where I talked about ensuring that when you're in your adult circles, that some of these behaviors that could be considered bullying for young persons in their development, that you're aware those surroundings, and if others are doing such, that you're sort of doing what you want your kid to do in a situation where bullying is seen. I think we're very limited on time and resources, but it's always good to persuade, our young people to pursue their interests and use activities as a way to build sort of friendships. One of the things that I fear a lot of times is that, I can get a hold of a young person through text, and they feel comfortable doing this. A couple of years ago, I had a project for youth, and it was a critter corn stand at a farmer's market. And one of the rules were, because of the amount of texting, that all the youth had to put their cell phones in a sort of, a basket for the duration that they were on, right, on their shift. And at one point, I remember a young person being in total panic and not being able to be out there. And it wasn't because they couldn't do it. It was that they needed to hold their cell phone. That was their security. So it's actually really interesting, when you think about these things, that sometimes the thing that you think of, that communication thing sometimes is important for people to have, just holding it, right? And as adults, we all know, right? If we lose our cell phones, we go nuts because our entire life is there. I think for a young person, it's also the same thing, but it's also such a dangerous tool, right? Help your child develop strategies and skills for handling bullying. And I think that role playing, those conversations, the situational conversations, are really, really helpful, because you get to play those things out. You know, keep in contact with your teacher, with your kids' teachers, to see if they see any changes. Right. So I think this is a hard one because we are busy and sometimes we only see the teachers during parent teacher time, or when our kids have a situation where we have to interact with the teachers. And then I would always sort of connect with the counselors about what is the policy of their school or their institutions about bullying, what resources they have, what methods they use to intervene in these situations long before you have to experience it. And we hope that you don't have to experience it, but knowing the limitations of the space that your kid is in or that young person is in is super helpful, because it also reminds you of where you need to show up that young person. How to protect yourself from being a bully, and these are things that we want to convey to that young person, right? Don't respond, don't show reactions. I think there's also the concept that bullies like to see you react, and they like to see the upset, and that's the satisfaction, right? Sort of that controlling of someone's actions by causing them to have a predicted sort of actions. Sort of exercise how to calmly and assertive tell someone to stop. Sometimes someone has never been able to get the courage to say stop. And having a young person sort of practice what that sounds like, and enunciating it in a non-real situation could be really helpful. Avoid areas where there's not many students or teachers around. Sort of not isolating yourself in a place where it's not safe. First, it's not safe to be by yourself in a lot of places, but also seeking those places where there's a system around, a support system around. And these are things, bringing expensive things or money or items, sneakers, whatever it may be, to school. And it's a difficult one because these things are also status, and if you don't have them, people can tease you over those things. So just being cautious of it and being aware of these things and how it can actually impact what you're thinking. And we're almost there, and I know this is a lot of fast-moving items. How to protect yourself from bullying continues, right? So sit with groups of friends at lunch or on the bus. It's a good question to ask, like, who are your lunch friends at school, right? And who are your bus friends if your young person is taking the bus, or if they're on public transportation, who do you hang out with? Walk, with friends or a teacher to your class if you don't feel safe. So these are the things that we want to convey to our young person to keep in mind as they're trying to find themselves in safe spaces and to avoid some of these. And the thing that's always true, report, please. Anytime you are feeling uncomfortable, unsafe, please report it, right? To an adult, a counselor, or a trusted person. And the list of solutions for bullying does not include telling your child to fight back. And this is one that it's a hard one, because there's a cultural sort of component to it. There's a societal component to it. But in the space that we're operating from, there's lots of consequences if we use that, right? And it's a hard one to sort of say this as an absolute, and nothing that I say is an absolute. But it's an encouragement to not necessarily use this. This can be more dangerous for that young person for many reasons. It can impact their space at school. It can impact their physical, if they're sort of fighting with someone who's older, bigger, if there's a group. So there's a lot of components why this may not be the best reaction. But I do understand parents who sort of give the instruction that, if it's a dangerous situation and you need to defend yourself, you need to defend yourself, right? I'll leave it there, because this is a hard one to, and if I put myself in the shoes of someone, it's a hard one to align myself with an absolute on that one. 4 things that happen online, those online, you got to stop, block, and tell someone. And it's a really important component to do. The other part is they find ways to sort of, you can block someone, they'll find another way. So you have to be vigilant on that. So stopcyberbullying.org is a good resource to really talk about if that's showing up. And these are components within the systems, right? So it violates terms of service in a lot of sort of websites. And remember that the minimum age to be on some of the social media platforms are 13. So you want to make sure that you don't have a 12-year-old in some of these platforms, and monitoring their interactions within the space. So these are, and their parents are controls in a lot of these systems, but just be advised, our young people are super smart, and they'll Google and they'll move these things. So I think that the conversations seems to be sort of the first course of action. And these are things why sometimes when we're looking at our child and how they're showing up in the world, these are things that we as parents or adults, advocates and supporters of young people should, take into consideration when we're looking at could your child be sort of bullied, right? So if they're struggling to fit in, if they look or act different, if they're going through a transition, whether death or divorce or change of schools, or going from middle school to high school, or going from elementary to middle school, if they're witnessing bullying in other places. So it's something to just keep in mind. So if your child is being bullied, don't ignore the situations. Ask the institutions around you about the behavior they've seen at school. Ask your child about giving other students a hard time. I think That's another aspect. Sometimes it's not just the bullying, but sometimes it's the reactionary situation that our young people sometimes do with others. Ask your child to tell you about what they wish their school day would look like. Look for clues. Is your child lonely, struggling academic? Decide whether you can work with a child to correct the behavior, or if you need outside help, really support that transition. I always say that it's always amazing to me, no matter how much I say something, it is when someone says exactly the same thing to that young person's, they seem to hear it from someone else. So if your child is in that situation where they're being their aggressor, they're being the bully, really having a dialogue and finding out, right? So is it a condition because they're being bullied and they're bullying others? Is it a conditioned, some of the things that we are describing here? And seek out assistance, right? Sometimes we don't intervene in time, and there's lots of resources around many of us. I know Jessica's here. I know Katie and Larry also have support in the system, so they're good resources for this level of conversations. Children who bully are more likely to get into fights, be injured in a fight, steal property or vandalize, drink alcohol, smoke, drop out of school, carry weapons. And these are not absolutes, and these are very sort of sort of generalizing sort of the situations is just the piece that I would like people to remember. Is you have to be vigilant, you have to observe, you have to listen, and you want to look for these signs. It is super hard for young people to sort of navigate the space that they are navigating in this era, and it's different than when we experienced it, right? How else can you help? Again, the self-confidence, the self-esteem, giving a young person the ability to navigate some of these spaces. We shouldn't call out a child's faults, limitations, um, tease them. These things are not helpful. Compliments specifically and sincerely. Sometimes in my house, I'm a first gen of my family that are college, and I think they don't realize this, but for forever I'm like, oh, he's a college kid, he's a smart kid, he's not like the rest of us, right? And it's like, oh, smarty pants, you should know the answer to that. You went to college, you graduated from high school, you wear a shirt and tie to go to work. And these things are not helpful, right? It stays with you, and here I am, I'm not gonna say how old I am, but I'm still repeating these things. So along the way, there's a marker that has left that with me. Encouragement, to go to outside activities, build friends, and sometimes it's you spending time with them in some activities, and then help your child fit in. Consider parents and communication skills. And I think the way that we've built society right now, we've created very isolated spaces for our young people, and we've also created tools where they're just a image that they talk to, right? So we lose that humanity side of. And then lastly, there's a couple of things to take a look at. There's some websites, and we'll share them with you and with this team so they can share with you. And I heard that there was a whole bunch of questions, so I'm excited to see what kind of questions. Thank you.
So there's one question here about, are there national policies on anti-bullying laws, or is that done on a state level or a school district level?
So there's standards. There's definitely standards. There's standards within the education system. There's that sort of come down, and then every institution has to have a plan in place. And I think it's really important that no matter where you're at, that you're looking at what is the plan that that institution has to deal with this. And as with many things, right? So there's neighborhoods that are rich in resources, and there are neighborhoods that are not rich in resources. You have to think that not all institutions are rich with resources. Sometimes these things are not in place. So it's important to sort of navigate these things when you're entering. I think when your young person moves into a new school, it's like, hey, what do you do in this, and how do you combat this, and what is the process? And sometimes they'll say we'll have a auditorium once a year and talk about that. And that's like, maybe that's not enough, because who I was when I started is not who I am when I ended that first year or that second year or that third year. There are national standards, there are state standards, and there's local standards from implementations.
Okay, so another question is, it seems like bullying is increasing in the United States. Are specific school programs and interventions that are working well against bullying and making an awareness of bullying? In other words, are there good model programs?
So this is an interesting question, and I'm going to say that, and this is a dangerous sort of answer. There are programs who are working for a population within a particular location, and sometimes these things are not duplicatable. So I think that you have successes based on sort of the structure and the space that the population is, and sometimes you can't take that across the street or across the county. So this is one of those things where the best model is when we have the parents sort of connected to the system and are helping both the educators, the institutions, and the implementers to fulfill the needs of sort of the population that they currently have. And I would say this, that some years the population is different enough that some of these policies and procedures should be revised. There's some years where English is not the dominant language, and you have a whole bunch of different groups coming together that you're needing to sort of take a different approach. So it's a really interesting dynamic. I think the piece and the most successful ones that I can sort of think of is where parents, community members, providers are all working. And this is why it's so important to sort of address this issue on an annual basis within those institutions, because I know of a particular institution where the biggest champion for the subject matter that we're discussing right now retired, and there was no institutional memory, and you just assumed that it would be there, and it wasn't there because that champion wasn't there. And when it started to happen, they just could not figure out what it was, and it was like, yeah, your champion that was using play to sort of demonstrate and to get kids to talk and react and partner up was no longer in that institution. So I think it's a great question. It's one of those that I would say we have to be proactive and work with those institutions and figure a way to do this annually and look at the limitations. There's some times right now that I think it's going to be a super sort of big issue. We have a shift in the workforce, right? So we have a lot of educators who are leaving education. We're going to have a whole bunch of new teachers, and this will be a new subject. So having the parents who may be able to, or the advocates and the supporters and the institutions that provide those resources annually sort of re-engaging where we left off is a super important thing. And every transition that happens, it's always weird to see the successes that we have with bullying in middle school, and when the same kids move from middle school into high school that are within the same district, they find themselves in a total different world. And I was like, why doesn't this translate across? So I hopefully I don't beat a horse to a dead horse on this. I think they're definitely models. They just have to be worked vigilantly in the system.
So there's a question about, are there written bullying policies in school districts available for the parents to see? And but I think your point is well taken, Jonathan, that even though they may be written down, and the schools obviously are going to make those available, if they're not repeated and talked about each year, it doesn't necessarily matter. So
and that's it's a great point. I think it's really important to note the following. You need them in your hands. As I early talked about, is you want to see if those policies aligned with your values, because you're sending your kid in with your values of what this could be, what bullying is in your house or consider, and it may not align, right? So there's a school board that you can talk about looking at that policy and be more inclusive to your what you're experiencing. So there's other, these things should be reviewed, and the definition should be expanded. So you should always have a copy of these things in your hand so that you know how the system will react, and if your young person will be a target or could be a target. I think that it's important to make sure that safety net is in that place. And if they don't, then also that then they need to have it, right? Like it's one of these things where, if you go to a school and like, we don't have it, that's like, well, it actually should be everywhere. I mean, this should not be something they pull off. But unfortunately, it's one of those things where I think our involvement, Washington County Kids involvement, Jessica Sims, 24-hour a day crusader for this, we should all, and you that attending should all be sort of vigilant on this thing. And the piece with it is that it is evolving and changing. And that's the other piece to be reminded that what we said 6 months ago may not be what is showing up today. We talked about Facebook here. We talk about Instagram. No one's talking about TikTok.
So that's actually a good question.
Go ahead and share that. That we have a question about TikTok that I do want you to cover. And I know we're over time, but this is really a great question that I would like you to answer. So Kelsey asks, my daughter has been bullied on TikTok by kids at her school posting about her, but she doesn't have TikTok. So she hears about it from other kids at school. She's unable to stick up for herself. And I've let the school admins know, but they say it's difficult to shut down these accounts and to find out who they belong to. So do you have any advice on how to handle it?
So that's a difficult one because of it's not a direct, and she doesn't know, but she knows the others, right? So the piece that I would ask the school to do, and this is where I would put the pressure, and this is just Jonathan, just being Jonathan, right? I would put the pressure on the school to have a no tolerance of bullying, whether on cyber, and name that's whether TikTok or, and if it shows up, you will all sort of have these the wrath of sort of cyberbullying, because I think the issue is she should report it, right? So she should definitely report it. She should report where she's hearing it. Because there's, and this is a horrible thing to do with kids and sort of go down this road. And I know that I'm being recorded, so this will come back to haunt me. But, sometimes, you think about a fire, and sometimes the person who started the fire is actually standing watching it. So sometimes there was nothing else but that person who's saying it is actually the person who's doing it, right? So it's one of these situations, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and all these components. People feel that because it's outside of the norm that they don't have a liability. But I think it's really important for the school to say that they will investigate fully any accusations of any cyberbullying and sort of reiterate. And I think this is also important for them to hear, we will process and investigate Instagram bullying and not call it cyberbullying. We will investigate and do TikTok bullying, because sometimes people cyberbullying, it's not something that is real. But when I'm calling out the platform itself, you're talking to you know who you're talking to. So I think it's a really important one. I would report it. I would ask the school to monitor their computer systems and seeing if kids are logging on to any of these platforms while they're in school, right? And send something out and a reminder to parents that if your child is logging on to social media and they are bullying their classmates, this is what the school's position on it is, right?
Jonathan, I want to say thank you again. You tackled a tough subject that's going to continue for a long time, and with a lot of compassion. So we really appreciate you spending the time with us tonight.
I appreciate you having us. It's just a perspective. I think the important part is to continue this relationship of getting more knowledge and working with each other and having these conversations. So thank you, Washington Kids, and thank you, Jessica and Larry, for having it. And I think the most important people here are the ones who came to listen to this and be engaged and believe that this is an important subject for them. So, I encourage you to stay connected, because I think this is the only way we're going to change this. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Good night, everyone.